So, for generation, people are asking the same question: what's wrong with Russia? I have to say that unfortunately everything is wrong with Russia. Russia was never a democracy. It was a monarchy until 1917. It was communist dictatorship until 1991. Russia existed only as an empire. This is very important because we are dealing with this problem even now. So Russia was an empire prior to 1917. Russia was Soviet empire until 1991. Russians never experienced freedom until 1991. This is also very important to understand. So this was never a free country until recently, until 1991. In addition to this, Russians were killed by millions by its own government. Since 1917, the terror was huge. Again, we are talking about millions of people who were killed. And those who were killed were usually the smartest, the more active people, of course. And those who survived actually were so much afraid that they were probably, afraid for the entire life, for their entire life. And they were never active. They never trusted the government. They never trusted the state. The idea was to survive, because again, millions and millions of people went through labor camps and prisons, right? And those who survived were very much afraid. And this changed slightly, right? When, of course, Gorbachev came to power. And he tried to reform the system. He tried to build Soviet Union with a human face. There was a very popular movement, those days in Eastern Europe, socialism with a human face. But the Soviet Union, of course, by that time was losing the war in Afghanistan, was missing the signs that there might be a disaster in Chernobyl. And Chernobyl, ironically, was in Ukraine. The Soviet Union, of course, was fighting for 10 years in Afghanistan without any success at all. So could Gorbachev reform this Soviet system? We know the answer: he could not. He failed. In August of 91, there was an attempt of hardliners led by KGB to take down Gorbachev and to return this, comparatively liberal Soviet Union back to the old kind of Soviet Union. So the Gorbachev was taken down. The people who replaced him, actually, because KGB in 91 failed, were people from the Communist Party as well. Boris Yeltsin, right, was a former communist apparatchik, but he successfully managed to become a very popular political leader. He went through elections and became first president of the Russian Federation. So when coup d'etat happened in August, and when crowds gathered on the streets of Moscow to protest against this putsch and to support democracy, Yeltsin immediately became a very popular leader on the streets. But look at this photo picture. This is very important one. This is the first day of Russian democracy. Yeltsin is giving speech on that armored car. And the man who is standing with him is Alexander Korzhakov. Alexander Korzhakov actually was one of security guard for Yuri Andropov, chairman of KGB. And he was placed to Yeltsin long before 91 to watch for him, to follow him, to know with whom Yeltsin is talking and meeting. The guy above him in that black suit, that tall guy, is actually Viktor Zolotov. Viktor Zolotov later would become in charge of personal security of Vladimir Putin. And now he's in charge of Rosgvardia, who is actually another kind of internal police which is going to deal with protesters on the street. So my point is the following: the revolution is just starting, right? But all figures who are leaders of democracy are already surrendered by KGB, high-ranking KGB officer. This is, of course, Anatoly Sobchak, who people were thinking is Democrat number two in Russia, who probably would replace Yeltsin if something happens to Yeltsin. And look who is behind. This is, of course, Vladimir Putin. Again, this is August of 91. These are the first days of the Russian Revolution. This is Putin again. Look at that guy to the right, is a scary one, right? He's future president of Russia. So Yeltsin, of course, is in the middle. Sobchak is to our left. I love this photo picture. I think this is like typical Putin. This is, of course, Andrei Lugovoy, a person who was responsible for killing Litvinenko in London in 2006. He was in charge, in August of 91, he was in charge of security of, first Russian Democratic Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar. Again, the revolution is just starting, but all Democrats are already surrounded by major KGB officers. That's why democracy had no chance in Russia, because everything was so much infiltrated by KGB. And we are talking about dozens of thousands of KGB officers infiltrated into Russian society. The way, a foreign intelligence usually was, so Russian intelligence as well, was sent sleepers abroad. That's how this was done. Those people who were infiltrated into the Russian society, KGB officers, were infiltrated secretly. No one, they would leave KGB building, would be transferred to major, industries. They would be placed as vice presidents of banks. They would be placed as deputy directors of major newspapers and TV channels. And again, we are talking about dozens of thousands of people. By August of 91, everything was under KGB control. And it took them just several years, of course, to take control of the entire country. Through the First Chechen War, through the Second Chechen War, by September of 99, when the Second Chechen War started, Yeltsin was actually forced to resign. And in exchange for promising to leave him, alone, allowing him to live peacefully and quietly after he would resign. So there were three candidates offered to Yeltsin to choose the successor. This is Sergei Stepashin. Sergei Stepashin actually was instrumental in organizing the First Chechen War. This is December of 94. He was in charge of the FSK, Federal Security, which preceded the FSB. The next candidate was Yevgeny Primakov. Yevgeny Primakov, he is to the right. He was in charge of SVR, Soviet Foreign Intelligence, the former main first directorate of KGB. The major department, actually, of KGB, Foreign Intelligence. And this is, of course, is Vladimir Putin. He was candidate number 3, and he was director of the FSB. So there were 3 candidates for Yeltsin to choose. The problem with them was that all of them were from KGB. So you could choose anyone, but the KGB is coming, well, the FSB is coming to power. So Yeltsin stopped with Putin, resigned on 31st of December 99, made Putin acting president of Russia without elections. Again, in a country with no experience in democracy, to be acting president of Russia basically means to be president of Russia. So Putin came to power without any elections. And as soon as he came to power, he went through elections several months later. He started to promote to major government and political positions other KGB officers. So in several months, Russia literally was under the control of high-ranking officers of KGB, starting with Putin. So he's in power for 22 years now. He plans to be in power until 2036. He changed constitution for this. He forced the Russian Supreme Court to confirm that he is allowed to stay as president until 2036. So, what's wrong with this picture? Everything. The problem, of course, is that, again, we are dealing for the first time in history with situation when a major nuclear state is run by state security as institution. This never happened before. I mean, if we look at the history of the world, we were dealing with monarchs, we were dealing with dictators, we were dealing with juntas, we were dealing with political parties. But a state security would never run a country. This just never happened. So what we are dealing with, of course, is the result of state security running the country without any political control. In the Soviet years, KGB, of course, existed, and it was very powerful. But they had political control in the form of the Communist Party. Right, this was Communist Party, this was not, a good party at all. Nevertheless, there was a political control. So since 91, KGB, which became the FSB, did not have any political control. And that's what we are facing now. When in the Soviet Union, political parties did not exist because there was monopoly of the Communist Party. But now, in Russia, Russia became the only country where political parties are not fighting for power, because this power belongs to KGB and everybody, the FSB, and everybody knows this. In Russia, in today's Russia, we are witnessing for the first time a situation when the army is under state security. Again, you will not find too many examples, probably no examples at all, when the army would be under the command of state security. Again, what we are dealing with now is the result of precisely this situation, when state security runs both political parties, parliament, the government, and the army. This leads to the idea to take control finally, not of the Russia only, because Russia was taken in 2000, but to start to implement the program of rebuilding the world. And the war which we are experiencing now is this realization of this dream, right, to control first Europe, but initially the entire world. Putin has this idea that the Soviet Union should be rebuilt. He gave many speeches to this extent. The war which we witnessed, which started on 24th of February, for him was never the war about Ukraine only. Ukraine was just the first plan, right? The realization of this plan started in 2008 when Russia first occupied the portion of Georgia, started the war in Georgia. Then, of course, they extended these occupations or attempt to occupy with Crimea in 2014. Then, of course, they made an attempt to take control over eastern Ukraine. And again, the idea was initially, to proceed even further to Transnistria. Transnistria, if you see this section in red, is a part of Moldova where a Russian-speaking population lives. And so when we see now this attempt of the Russian army to get to Odessa, this was important because they wanted to get to Transnistria, because the Russian troops are already there. They're there since approximately 92, and they're waiting for that land corridor to be created so Russia would extend the war in Ukraine to Moldova and take control of Moldova. Transnistria it's an interesting story, a tragic one, because this is a land frozen in time. They're still kind of the Soviet republic. They're not really even pro-Russian. They're still Soviet. They have Soviet symbols, red flags, etc., etc. Putin, of course, also during these years took control of Belarus. In 2021, very quietly, before the invasion of Ukraine, he actually occupied Belarus. And there are Russian troops now, of course, we know this. Lukashenko is not an independent leader, even not an independent dictator. We also do know this. And this was done quite quietly, right? So this Putin's idea to recreate the Soviet Union actually, was moving forward, right? Except that he has problems with Ukraine. Initially, the idea was, as we know, to proceed very quickly from Belarus in the direction of Kiev, to take Kiev, to kill or arrest or force out into exile Zelensky and Ukrainian government, and then to combine actually armies of Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, and start immediately advancing, well, first very quickly into Moldova, but Moldova is comparatively small and weak country. But then what's important to Eastern Europe, because although, of course, the Baltic states, as we all know, are members of NATO, initially the plan was to use this combined army to advance into the Baltic states and wait if NATO would risk or start a nuclear war, because conventionally NATO did not have forces in Europe which would be equal to this, 300,000 probably plus army which Putin was planning to use against Eastern Europe. So we, of course, do not know the answer what would happen if Ukraine would be taken, because Ukraine was never taken, and approximately 137,000 people who crossed the border into Ukraine actually are gone, right? Some of them are killed. We do not know precisely. The Ukrainian government is giving estimate of like 58,000 people being killed. Even if this is less, it's still a huge amount of losses. You need to multiply this number by 3 because this is usually how many wounded people you have in relation to killed in the battle. So in other words, the Russian army, which crossed the border into Ukraine after 7 months of war, is gone. It doesn't exist. It's actually very difficult to push them out, and the reason why it's difficult to push them out because the weapons which Ukrainians are getting, leaving aside the fact that probably they're not getting everything they would like to have, and they probably are not getting everything in quantities they would like to have. But the main problem is that there are conditions imposed on which Ukrainians are getting all these weapons. They are not allowed to use them against Belarus and Russia, meaning that they're not allowed to attack or fire into Russian territory or into Belarus territory. Now, if you think about this from military point of view, you are not able to win the war if you are not allowed to fire or to attack the enemy's territory, because what's happening is that Russia is not only concentrating troops, of course, along the border of Ukraine on a Russian territory, on Belarus territory. They also fire from these territories into Ukraine. And the long-range artillery guns which Russia has and effectively using are 25 kilometers artillery guns. So the entire territory along the border, 25 kilometers deep into Ukraine, is actually covered by Russian artillery, and Ukrainians could not proceed and and push actually Russians. I think, did we lose the microphone? Okay, great. So, since that first echelon of the army, first 137,000 approximately, is gone, on 25th of August, Putin issued a decree increasing the amount of Russian army. It was difficult to calculate how many actually people would be added, but many analysts came to that figure, 137,000. This was on 25th of August. Then they started, as we know, to recruit prisoners who were serving time for crimes from Russian prisons. There are approximately 600,000 prisoners in Russia, and they're trying to recruit them into the army, promising them to be released in 6 months. Then, of course, on 21st of September, Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 additional troops. Once again, this is in addition to this decree of August of 25. And there is a secret clause in that particular decree about mobilization, number 7, which actually tells that they plan to mobilize not 300,000 people, but 1 million people. And the question is, do they need it for Ukraine only, or something else is going on? And I think here's the problem. Putin is not able to say that they are losing the war in Ukraine to Ukrainians. what we hear more and more often, that they are losing the war in Ukraine because they're fighting against the entire West or against NATO. And so I think there is a great possibility that this 1 million people who is planned to be mobilized, and well, we have to say that we know how this mobilization is going on in Russia. We could not call it a success, at least, right? Because it seems to be that, even without a military activity, in relation to these new mobilized people, we already see them surrendering to other countries, right? They are surrendering to Georgia, to the Baltic states, to Finland. So it's questionable whether Putin would be able to get those 300,000, not speaking about 1 million. But nevertheless, let's say there are two parties or two groups of people around Putin. One is for a war with Ukraine. Another one is for a war with the entire West. And it seems to be that Putin is slowly moving to the direction of that second group, which is kind of pushing him to declare a war against the entire West. Because it's clear to Putin that this war probably would never stay within the Ukrainian borders, because again it was never intended to take Ukraine only and stop with Ukraine. Russians are using a tactic which is not new, it's the old one. They are issuing Russian passports to citizens of other countries, those who are of Russian origin or Russian ethnic origin. This was what they were doing in Georgia or with Georgia in 2008. They started to issue Russian passports to citizens of Abkhazia, which is a Georgian, autonomous republic area, and to citizens of South Ossetia. They also started to issue foreign Russian passports to citizens of Moldova living in Transnistria. And so far they issued approximately 220,000 of those passports. Now, this is done in order to allow Russian propaganda to claim that there are Russian citizens living in Moldova who need to be defended against whatever Moldovan nationalists, something like this. Again, the same was done with Georgia when Russian troops invaded South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They were claiming, of course, that Georgians are killing Russian citizens in Georgia. Stalin was doing the same in 1939 and 1940 when he was occupying countries. When they took control over the Baltic states, they actually moved hundreds of thousands of people deep into Siberia. Many of them ended in labor camps, of course. Many of them were executed. Many of them were spending years and years in Russian prisons. The people who came to replace them in the Baltic states were mainly Soviet military personnel who actually stayed there. And when we think why there are so many Russians in the Baltic states and why they are so supportive of Russia and Russian government. These are mainly people, of military personnel, which stayed in the Baltic states after the Soviet Union occupied it. So what Putin is doing is not it's not new, right? He's taken quote unquote the best, experience of Stalin and Hitler, and trying to incorporate it into current Russian policies. Uh, does this mean that the entire Russian population supports Putin? This is difficult to say, probably not entire. We see those people who are trying to escape Russia now not wanting to be mobilized. But we already have experience with Germans who were supporting Hitler until the last day of the war. So I think that we better not spend too much time on analyzing logic of Russian population and leave this issue, for the period after the war. Now, the question is whether this picture is, too black and whether there is no space for optimism. And I think in a short sense, in a short period of time, right, we are going to face a very dangerous period. I do not think that this war will end very soon in Ukraine. I do not think that this war will be limited with war in Ukraine only. I think it will extend into Europe, and I think the 24th of February of this year would be later written in history books as the beginning of the Third World War. But I think there is a room for optimism. I do not think that Ukrainians might lose this war. I do not think that Russia might win this war. The question is how long this will take. The question is how much we would have to pay for the victory. And since Putin has no army, and he's not going to rebuild this army, the main danger now is nuclear weapons. And one of the options I think we are going to see, one of the problems we are going to face, is the attempt of the Russian government to move nuclear weapons to Belarus. Belarus was withdrawn from non-nuclear status some time ago after the beginning of war. And Lukashenko mentioned several times that he might ask Russian government to return nuclear weapons back in Belarus. And I think the reason why Belarus is kept independent, because we see how Putin loves this idea to annex territories. And we have to ask ourselves why Belarus is not annexed yet. I mean, he's fighting in Ukraine for every particular piece of territory to be annexed. Why he is not annexing Belarus? And I think the answer is that he is keeping Belarus independent, so he would be able to move nuclear weapons to Belarus and fire from Belarus, not from a territory of Russian Federation. Because if he fires from territory of Russian Federation, then of course the retaliation will be against the Russian Federation. But if he fires from Belarus, then the retaliation will be against Belarus. And Belarus is so small and so deeply, positioned inside Europe that it's very questionable whether you could retaliate against Belarus with the nuclear weapons. Probably not, because the radiation will spread around. And I think that's what we are going to happen, to seize or might see. So I think for this reason, while we are involved in a war against Russia in Ukraine, we actually should start to pay attention to Belarus. Because, of course, Lukashenko is a classical dictator, unlike Putin, who is not a dictator. He's actually a representative of KGB or FSB system, running the country. And I think to take Belarus from Putin's control would be smart, and from security point of view is important, because not only Putin would lose geopolitical Belarus, which allows him, of course, to go to borders of several Eastern European countries, but he also would use the opportunity to use Belarus as a platform for firing nuclear weapons into Europe. And as I mentioned, Putin has no conventional army anymore. This just doesn't exist. So the nuclear option is the only one for him. But it exists only because he might fire from Belarus without being, afraid to get retaliation to Russian territory. So that's what I think where we are now. The unknown question is, again, how long this will take, how much will pay, what's going to happen with Russia after this war. And I think that the Russian Federation, as a result of this war, will collapse in a format which exists today. I think this will be, at the end, very healthy for Russia, the way it was healthy for Germany in 1945. I think for Russia, in order to rebuild and reform itself, it has to go through defeat similar to a defeat of Germany in 1945 or defeat of Japan in 1945. And I think this is precisely what's going to happen. And we do know the conditions for the future peace agreement with Russia, right? It's of course the they have to stop the war, they have to stop military activities, withdraw troops from Ukraine, but they also have to recognize the borders of 2007. This is prior to occupation of Georgia. They also would have to pull troops out of Transnistria, because they're there without invitation of the Moldovan government. They probably have to agree to reconsider the status of Kaliningrad, because now they're using Kaliningrad to blackmail Europe that they will attack with nuclear weapons from Kaliningrad. And this, of course, should lead us to a conclusion that we, should reconsider the status of Kaliningrad for Russia. They also have to agree to allow the international court to sentence all those who are committing crimes during this war, starting with Putin himself, if he survives the war, what is questionable, because probably he would not. And then the most important point is that the only structure which survives the collapse of the Soviet Union as a structure which is more than 100 years old, the Russian state security, should be dissolved without possibility to be reformed or renamed and appear as well, because this is the main institution responsible for all problems which we are facing now. So if this happens, the world will be safe and peaceful, and we are on the way to this. Again, the question is how long this will take. All right, I will end by now.